Hello and welcome to today's video debate on the future of biofuels in Europe. I'm Dave Keating and I'm here in the European Parliament, where MEPs are currently debating legislation that will have a huge impact on the type of fuel you put into your car in the future. The European Commission has proposed changes to the EU's renewable energy law that would phase out EU support for conventional biofuel in Europe. There's been concern that these conventional fuels actually could cause more emissions than they are able to abate because of changes in farming practices used to grow the crops for these biofuels. The Commission says the EU should switch to supporting only new second-generation biofuels. But the problem is most of the biofuels on the market today are first generation, and getting rid of them could possibly mean no biofuels at all. This could leave the EU with a big black hole in its strategy to meet its decarbonization targets for transport. There are also concerns that some of the bad first-generation biofuels are tainting some of the good conventional ones. So, are we throwing the biofuel baby out with the bathwater, or are we making a responsible change to EU law which will stop bad farming practices? Well, with me here to debate this today, I have two prominent voices on this issue. To my right, I have Bas Eickhout. He's a Green MEP from the Netherlands, who has been working very closely on this file. And to my left, I have Emmanuel Desplechin from the renewable ethanol association ePURE. This is one of the fuels affected by this change. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Bas, let me start with you. You will be faced with the task of voting on this change in the coming months in the Environment Committee. What's your reaction to the Commission's proposal to phase out conventional first-generation biofuels?
I think the direction that the Commission is taking is a good direction. I think we have to be fair. We created a market ourselves, right? We put targets on renewables within the transport sector, and with that we were putting targets on biofuels coming on the market. So it's a heavily subsidized market that we created at policymakers. But we also know it is a land-based market, and we know that land is a scarce resource as well. So we have to make sure that what we are pushing for is also really delivering carbon reductions. And I think we've seen in the past, we've seen some bad examples, we've seen some good examples. So that the Commission is trying to steer in that, I think it's a good way. What I'm a bit concerned about is that the discussion is becoming a bit of a black and white debate. So first generation is bad, needs to go down, and the good ones are the advanced. But of course also within advanced biofuels, not everything will be good. So we have to have a bit more nuanced debate, and I'm trying to get that through my report, through my changes to the legislative proposal by the Commission.
Emmanuel, from the perspective of renewable ethanol, what concerns you about the proposal as it's on the table right now?
Well, to us, the proposal of the European Commission is simply a missed opportunity to do the right thing when it comes to increasing the renewables in transport and actually decarbonize the sector. First, because the level of ambition is simply not good enough when it comes to transport. We are actually, with this proposal, backtracking on the 2020 ambitions. We had, for 2020, an objective of 10% of renewables in transport. Now we are proposing something that is much less, and at the same time we are dropping the main instrument to decarbonize transport fuels, the Article 7A of the Fuel Quality Directive, which I think Bas will agree with me should not happen. The second element is that, unfortunately, this is a proposal that actually plays renewables against each other. It seeks to displace first-generation biofuels to make room for advanced biofuel. And that, in the end, does not decrease Europe's dependence on imported fossil fuel. It only benefits oil. The third element, and I think that's where probably I will agree with Bas, is really that it's a proposal that ignores the mandate that was put by the Parliament and the Council on the European Commission. And that mandate was to create a stable framework that would promote sustainable biofuels with high greenhouse gas savings and low risk of indirect land use change. I would agree with you, Bas. There is a discussion which is too much of a black and white, but there is also, in the part of the first generation biofuels, good biofuels. And what we need to make sure is that we actually incentivize those biofuels that saves genuine greenhouse gas emission, have low risk of adverse effects, whether they're crop-based or residue-based, and that we actually phase out, if anything, the bad biofuels.
Well, yeah, let's talk about those different types of biofuels. As you say, Bas,
Yeah.
this is, for a lot of people, turning into a very black and white issue. There are some of these first generation biofuels which are a very high concern. I think the most prominent one is palm oil. This is the one that gets mentioned quite a lot. If we don't want this to be a black and white issue, how do we differentiate the different types of fuel? And do you agree that there's some kind of gradient here where you have palm oil that's of a lot of concern and different types?
Well, I think the problem is you cannot really, in lawmaking, just forbid one type and say to the other type that's a good one. Because, well, there are, of course, also international trade rules where you cannot do that. So the solution is to look at the sustainability criteria. How can we develop criteria which are fair and honest to all the different types, and if you comply with it, then you can call yourself a sustainable biofuel and you can count towards the targets. I think we have to put back on the table the debate of indirect land use. I think that is a very important point. A lot of studies that show sometimes theoretically this is a very good biofuel, what they misjudge is that it's always in a theoretical study where theoretically you can go to a very low productive land and theoretically you can grow it. But what does a market player do? Of course he goes to high productive land. He's not going to a low productive land, quite often not very accessible, far away, so your product is not easily being transported. You go for the well-connected, high productive land. From that moment you are in competition with other practices used for that high productive land. Think food. So in order to have criteria on the table for that, you need the debate of indirect land use change. What we mean with that is if you put something on land that is already used for other purposes and that other purpose is moving away and moving to another field where deforestation is happening, it's having a bad impact on biodiversity, it's having a bad impact on the carbon balance because you are deforesting, you should take into account that. The ones who are doing good can show, hey, but my indirect land use change impact is very low, so I comply with that. So it means maybe a bit more complexity in the criteria, but the outcome is a much fairer promotion of the good ones and indeed punishing those who score not good on that, on land use change. And for example, palm oil is one of those.
Well, the problem, of course, with these indirect land use changes is they're notoriously hard to measure. And we've seen a lot of controversy over how exactly we measure these things. Emmanuel, do you agree that ILUC, as it's called for short, indirect land use change, should that be more incorporated into the legislation?
Maybe to your surprise, I'm not too far from what Bas has actually expressed. We are not ILUC deniers to start with. That we understand that there might be some concerns about displacement, about the use of land for crops that would then be used for the biofoods production. Now, this debate has lasted for quite a number of years. We've had different studies. The most recent one, Globiome, was ignored by the European Commission in its proposal. We still have an annex that serves absolutely no purpose in the proposal on indirect land use change. But what we know, and what you know as well, is that the source of the ILUC controversy is actually peatland drainage in Southeast Asia for the magnitude that would actually be able to hinder the greenhouse gas credentials of biofuels. So that is what needs fixing in the first place. And yes, there are trade rules, but there are also rules that allow you to protect the market if there are some valid environmental concerns. On that note, the European Parliament very recently adopted a resolution that actually calls for the phase out of palm oil and derivatives for their use in biofuels. We are one of the very few industry voices that have actually not only worked on that file, but also supported that file. And that's something that we would like now to see translated in hard legislation, and the Renewable Energy Directive 2 is the perfect opportunity. Now, what science tells us as well is that indeed there are biofuels that have low risk of ILUC. Okay? Whether we are going to be able to use this ILUC science, as a regulatory tool, I don't know. I know that there is resistance in the Council, there is resistance in this House, but at least we have all the tools, all the elements of knowledge about ILUC that actually we could use that as a proxy to determine what biofuels are actually worth promoting and those that are better not supported by EU policy. And again, I go back to the mandate that you've put on the Commission, which was repeated in June last year as part of the report on renewable energy in June, you said, please, Commission, come up with a framework that will incentivize high greenhouse gas savings, low risk of ILUC. We know which one these are. Okay? Ethanol definitely qualifies. And if there are concerns about the sustainability of biofuels, we are all for strengthening these sustainability criteria. We also call for sustainability criteria for advanced biofuels, because otherwise we are already pre-programming reopening of this RED II directive in 2-3 years.
But you see, we are already moving into a direction where we can really find agreements, because if we are saying, okay, let's make the criteria, the sustainability criteria tougher, stricter, so that the good ones who fulfill those criteria can really still grow. The thing is that one of the problems that you're having with the Commission's proposal is this cap for this first generation that is going down. But if you make sure that within that cap the bad ones are really removed, then remains growth for those under that cap that are good. So that is very important, why it is so crucial to really make the strict distinction between the good and the bad ones under that cap. And I think with stricter criteria we can promote the good ones, there's still place to grow, and we can limit those, we can phase out those who are just not renewable. That is one thing on the first generation one. Another problem we are having is what we see is that, as you said in your introduction, from the start we said, okay, first generation is a first generation, it will develop into second generation, hence the terminology. What we see in practice is that the first generation is more or less eating up the room that is there for the mandate for biofuels, and the really development of second generation advanced biofuels, it's not happening.
That's because of the subsidies, because it's so highly subsidized.
Exactly, it's highly subsidized and it's eating up the space. So if you now, and that's why I think there is some capping of this first generation needed, but within that cap, more distinction between the good and the bad ones, and then we have room for promoting a bit more the advanced biofuels, but I fully agree there. Also within the advanced biofuels, we should make sure we are promoting the good ones, because otherwise we are repeating our mistakes in the past, and that we should prevent.
So fundamentally, I don't disagree with what you're saying. The only difficulty I have in the approach is when we say we have to make room for renewables. And I think that's a trap that we could fall in. Because we want to phase out the first generation. I mean, the Commission's proposal wants to phase out the first generation as a means to incentivize the advanced biofuels. Next step will be to phase out the advanced biofuels as a means to make room for renewable electricity. What we would want is actually to have a framework that actually maximizes the renewable, low-carbon energy in transport, instead of playing all these renewables against each other, because in the end the only ones that are laughing right now are the fossil fuel industry.
I want to move on to another subject in addition to the indirect land use change that has been hard to measure and controversial, which is the effect
I do want
on...
to say something on that, because you are keeping saying that it's hard to measure.
Yeah.
If you see how policies are being conducted in Europe on, for example, GDP projections, and what kind of tough programs we did on Greece, for example, on the basis of GDP projections, no one ever questioned what are these GDP projections really doing. So we are basing a lot of policies, and I would say even more far-reaching policies, on other projections. Yes, you will have dependency of model outcome, but we're doing that in many political fields. So let's not treat this one suddenly as a kind of out-of-space approach.
It's true,
this is pretty normal.
It's not a sole phenomenon here in this building.
Exactly. Just want to make that point.
But on food prices, so another issue that's been presented by the Commission with these conventional biofuels is its possible effect on food, the whole food versus fuel dilemma. The Commission has even taken to referring to these fuels as food-based fuels. Is this, this is another area where we're not quite sure what the effect is. There's lots of different thoughts on this. And some critics say that the land use change from growing the biofuels could be displacing food crops and causing rises in food prices and causing hunger even. Bas, is this, for in your mind, the food versus fuel debate, is this a concrete thing? Is it definitely causing food effects?
There's absolutely a link, of course. It is through land, because it's both land-based. It's, like I said, it's both using highly productive land. So there is a trade-off. I mean, people say there is no link, are absolutely lying. But in the public debate, sometimes this link has become very big and maybe a bit too big. The issue is, as long as there's no pressure on your food system, the link is very low. The issue becomes when there is scarcity. For example, when there is a bad harvest year. And this is my problem a bit with the mandate that the EU has been giving. It's very inflexible. It was a percentage that needs to be produced every year. So if you then are not meeting that mandate, you are being punished. But that's very inflexible, and of course the real world out there is much more variable. So if there is a bad harvest year, and you still need to meet those blending obligations, then you will of course see an impact on the prices, because then the pressure will go to another sector, which is quite often food. So that link is only there when there is scarcity. So I think, and that's why I also fully agree, that the Commission completely deleted, in a way, dealing with a reduction target and only dealing with a more or less blending mandate is not wise. So I will certainly put back on the table the debate, why are we not putting a greenhouse gas reduction target on the transport sector and not only a technological push for one fuel being biofuel. I think there we really have to have a debate as well.
Emmanuel, what's your take on the food versus fuel debate?
So let me just a second on the qualitative approach. I think we agree. If we can have a qualitative approach, that would be probably the best thing going forward. One country in particular has taken that route, in Germany. The reality is that today in Germany, if your biofuel doesn't deliver 70% savings, you don't get into the market. So it works. And there is absolutely no reason, apart from lack of political courage, not to put back the Article 7A of the Fuel Quality Directive on the table. On the food versus fuel debate, I obviously have a different view. The debate is not the same as it was in 2008, because in 2008 we had a price hike, and at the time biofuels were under discussion and the link was made very easily. But now we are quite some years after, and we have established that not only it was not biofuels that actually caused these food prices increases, but it was actually oil. The direct link between food prices and oil prices has been established. Since the Renewable Energy Directive was enacted, the biofuels production has increased 70% in Europe, and the food prices have decreased by 20%. I'll get to your point about the scarcity, but the reality is that biofuels actually contribute to food security today, and something that is very often forgotten, apart from this morning, for instance, in the debate in the Agricultural Committee, where they discussed the RED too. But you have to know that for every ton of ethanol that we produce from cereals, we also produce 1 ton of high-value protein animal feed, which is badly needed in Europe because we have a deficit. And otherwise we would need to import more soybean meal from Argentina. So we do contribute. But we also contribute to less volatility on the commodity prices. And if there is a surge in commodity prices, then it simply stops being economically wise to produce biofuels.
Unless there is a blending obligation set by a country, unless when you are forcing the market to do that, and unless that market is highly subsidized as it is now. I mean, it's not a unsubsidized free market. So there are some issues there which you are overlooking a bit too quickly here.
I think there the last years have not given any of these circumstances, really, and it's always a possibility for fuel suppliers to pay a penalty instead of paying for the biofuel that he would need to incorporate.
Yeah, but
so
like
there
I
is
said,
some degree of flexibility.
It plays more when there is scarcity, and the last couple of years has not been. By the way, because we increased our emissions of deforestation. So there are these kind of links happening as we speak as well. So if you look at the carbon balance, we're not doing fine yet.
Would not disagree on the carbon balance, but I think the market already provides some flexibility in the mechanism. That's one area where we can disagree. For us, the evidence has been widely reported. The European Commission every 2 years issues a progress report where it has to look into this particular issue, and it has gone from not being a problem to being absolutely negligible when it comes to the impact of ethanol on commodity prices.
Emmanuel, Bas, thank you so much for joining us today for this
You're welcome.
very vibrant discussion. These discussions will obviously continue here in the European Parliament over the coming months.
They will.
And thank you at home for watching this debate today.
Thank you.